Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. And welcome back to one of our favorites, former Rocky Mountain Bureau Chief of Aviation Week and Space Technology, whose expertise as a flight test engineer and experienced Air Force officer also proves his mettle as a researcher and writer. Not surprisingly, these credentials encourage Brigadier General Titus to select him as the right man to produce and create the definitive work documenting his career. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce pilot, engineer, and author, Bill Scott.
Thank you, Cindy. Chances are you never heard of him, but one of the most engaging life stories, most varied life stories of any air warrior out there is that of Brigadier General Robert F. Titus. This is an overview of his life and what's in the book. So real quick, 32-year military career in both the Army and the Air Force, served in 3 different wars, logged over 550 air combat missions. Why do we put the plus? Because he said he kind of forgot to log a few of those. I was a test pilot during the golden years out here when they're developing the Century fighters, Century series. He set nuclear alert in Europe, shot down 3 MiG-21s in Vietnam, and he's known as the father of the F-15 Eagle. So I'll tell you more about all those along the way. His early years, he was born in 1926, and so he's sort of a child of the Depression. Family had to move a lot, and he actually went to 2 different high schools. Wasn't much of a student, didn't have the right attitude until his senior year, and then he buckled down and got to work. He graduated, finished everything, but he never got a high school diploma. And his mother had applied to Virginia Tech for him, so he went to Virginia Tech in engineering, mining engineering, for 1 semester, but promptly on his 18th birthday, 6 December 1944, he joined the Army. And right away, he volunteered to be a paratrooper. But when he checked in for that, they said, nope, can't be a paratrooper, you're too tall. 6'1", he's 1 inch too tall. Well, he was pretty bummed out, and so he went back and said, I definitely want to be a paratrooper. And Doc said, well, why? And he said, I'll make a man of me. So the doc said, put him down as 6 foot, and away he went. So he, as part of the training, it was pretty clear they were training to jump into Japan if we had to invade the islands there. And he got his wings on 2nd of August. 4 days later, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. A few days later, Nagasaki was hit. So there in early September, the war was over. But he stayed in the Army, stayed in the 82nd Airborne, and in January of '46, he marched in the New York City Victory Parade. And the 82nd Airborne led that, 13,000 troops, and Titus led the leftmost column. And it stretched out for about 4 miles, including an awful lot of armor, tanks, self-propelled howitzers, etc., and led by a general that Titus really admired, Jumpin' Jim Gavin. So they had too many Army guys, so he mustered out, went back to Virginia Tech in September of '46. But in the spring of '48, there was an Air Force recruiter on base, and this guy said, hey, you can go to pilot training in the cadet program. Well, Titus said 1 trip to the bottom of a coal mine, and he decided maybe that wasn't for him after all. So he decided to go fly fighters. All he wanted to do was fly fighters. Went through pilot training, had some hiccups along the way. It's kind of interesting stories. But then, again, too tall. So they put him in B-25s. He was not happy there. But he was at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, and grumbling to an ops officer, and he said, well, what do you want to fly? He said, that, Mustangs. He said, go get a helmet and a chute. Went out, and jumped in a T6 Texan, flew around, and a guy said, "You really want to fly a Mustang?" "Well, I sure would like to, sir." So went over, leaned over the edge, put him in there and told him how to start it, basically what to watch out for on takeoff. Boom, away he went. He became a P-51 pilot at that time. Did some flying in the States, and then all of a sudden the Korean War happened. Needed an awful lot of fighter pilots over there, so overseas he went. Initially he went to Japan, but then working the system, he managed to get down to K-46, a base in South Korea, and immediately went to work as a fighter pilot. Most of it was bombing and strafing, and on one particular mission they were coming back as a 3-ship, and he realized that the engine temperature was just climbing like crazy. He said about the time his feet got hot, he knew he'd lost a lot of cooling, so he popped the canopy, stood on the seat, jumped over the side, horizontal whacked him on the ankle, but it didn't hurt him too much. Down he came, but he was a very low altitude, only about 100 feet, he estimates. Had a hard landing, but fortunately, being an old paratrooper, he knew how to handle it. So he didn't know where he was, but he said very quickly, some guys helped him figure that out. He said, here came some guys in padded pajamas, quilted pajamas, and they were shooting at him. So he said, oh, this is not good. He pulled out his little trusty 45, popped a few back, and they went brrrt, and he said, oh, they're using automatic. So he ran and jumped into a bomb crater, peeked over the edge, and they were still coming. He said, man, this is not good. And then he hears this American voice say, keep your head down and crawl this way. He was just north of some Marine bunkers because he'd come down in the demilitarized zone, DMZ. So he crawled over there, the Marines chased him off the bad guys. He said, now how do I get back to his unit? The Marines pointed to a road over there, and he went over, thumbed a ride, about 20 miles south, back to his unit. By then it was dark. He went into these big tents. They usually had a bunch of pilots in these big tents. And the other 2 guys in his flight thought that he hadn't made it. They thought he had crashed with the airplane, so they were already dividing up his stuff. And he put an end to that. Well, he managed to fly 63 combat missions in the F-51, which is the same as the P-51. They're both Mustangs, but they'd changed the designation. And along the way, picked up his first Distinguished Flying Cross. But boy, they went through a lot of F-51s. All of them that were in the unit there at K-46 when he arrived, all of those were gone, as well as a lot of pilots. And the unit had dwindled down to about 5 or 6 airplanes, so they shut the unit down and sent some guys home, and others went over to F-86s. So that's where Titus went. He was in a unit commanded by Colonel Gabby Gabreski. And he talked about how cold it was. So anybody who ever served in the Korean War will tell you it was unbelievably cold. Obviously, the Army and Marines, they put up with the worst of it, but these pilots in the Air Force, they weren't immune either. They lived in these big tents, as I said. They had a potbelly stove in there that was fed by an oil drum outside. So when they'd go to bed at night, fully clothed in their sleeping bags, because it's the only way you begin to stay warm enough, the jerry can of water would be bubbling away nice and happily on top of that, that potbelly stove, but in the morning it would be frozen solid, and because of water in the oil line out there, it had frozen too, so it was good and cold by the time they got up in the morning. They were always short of supplies, even flight gear. Each pilot had one flight suit, so Titus tended to wear the woolen trousers that he had been issued in the Army, and didn't have enough helmets. So he said when it's time to fly, you go in, pick one off the rack that fit, and away you go. There's any number of other things. They were just very, very limited on supplies. Anyway, it was a quick checkout in the F-86, and about his 3rd mission, they went north of the Yalu River, and he said, well, I guess I'm now a checked out fighter pilot because we're in China and we're not supposed to be here. But the flight lead spotted a MiG-15, went after him, radio wasn't working, so Titus didn't know what was going on other than they were going after this MiG. Well, the MiG climbed and took off back to the north, so they turned back. He said it was the only MiG he saw the whole time he was, only airborne MiG he saw while he was over there. So they wrapped up his Korean War service with 101 combat missions, and in August '52 went back to the U.S. And he thought he was going to get out of the Air Force at that time, go back to school. But what he didn't realize is when he transitioned to the F-86, he had signed this document that basically said the Air Force gets to keep you as long as we want. So they sent him over to a ferrying squadron at Dover Air Force Base. So he was taking F-86s and F-84s primarily to Europe, but they had to move him around the U.S. As part of it. He flew 10 of these flights over to Europe, and in the process, every time they were over there and had a few days, he took advantage of being a tourist. So he went to Paris, and he went to everything. He said the museums, any performances of any sort. So he learned a lot about the culture, etc. And on one of these domestic flights, he flew an airplane down to Georgia. They would always take commercial flight back. So they were running late, and this cute little blonde flight attendant said, hurry up, get on there. Well, there wasn't very many people on board, so they chatted it up, and it wasn't long before he married that flight attendant, little Margie. And he was selected to go to Air Force Test Pilot School, so not long after they were married, they packed up their '53 Pontiac convertible and headed west to Edwards Air Force Base. And he was in class 54B, and things were moving fast. They were running three classes through the school at that time. When I went through in '75 as a flight test engineer, we were down to 2. But his course was roughly eight months long, and went through the standard stuff that all you flight test guys are familiar with: performance, stability and control, handling qualities, spins, etc. And he was really looking forward to just going down the street and jumping into the fighter ops and start testing all of those Century Series fighters, because it really was the golden age of flight testing there in the 50s. But some German engineer that was in charge of parachute development said, that guy is a qualified paratrooper as well as a test pilot. So they snagged him and sent him over to one of the detachments in El Centro. He wasn't real happy with that, but they put him in charge of the jumpers, and he went out and did a number of jumps to develop personal chutes, and they also developed extraction chutes to suck cargo, pull cargo out of aircraft like 119, etc. But he also flew aircraft, and they had a stray orphan YF-84J, which had been put forward as a competitor to the F-100, obviously the F-100 won. But they used that for these various tests, and he went out to fly a resupply container test. So it was a big container that they just hung under the center line. Well, the contractor built this thing with flat ends, but he wanted Titus to go up, get supersonic, make sure it would be all right. Well, he got up there, dove down from 30-some thousand feet, and couldn't go supersonic, and the whole container just ripped off. Didn't hurt the airplane, so they went back, put a bullet nose on it, off he goes again. So this time he pushes over, streaking down, and said as fast as the airplane would go, he started his pullout, and everything locked up because there was enough shock wave over that horizontal stabilizer that he no longer had pitch control. So he's yanking, and the contractor on the ground on the radio is saying, pull out, pull out. He said, what do you think I'm trying to do? And he finally got down into what he called, low enough air that things changed in terms of the shock wave. And he pulled out, but he said, I was down in the weeds, so no, maybe it's more like the sand, because he barely made it. He said if it hadn't been at El Centro, which was below sea level, wouldn't have made it. So he was in the little bar when the contractor showed up and said, I thought you had eaten it that day. Titus said, well, I did too, but dumb, blind luck beats skill any day. And that was pretty much his attitude his whole life. So in December 55, they sent him back over to Edwards, and he was in the fighter ops branch, and away he went. He started testing every one of the Century Series fighters except the F-107. And he was working with the legends of the time there. You know, Yeager, Bud Anderson was one of his bosses at one time. He chased Neil Armstrong, and of course Deke Slayton, and many of these are familiar names to us. And Ivan Kinchelow is one of those. Kinchelow, as most of you know, was killed in an F-104 shortly after takeoff from Edwards one time. What you probably didn't know was that Titus was supposed to take that flight. He had already briefed the mission. It was just to fly over to Palmdale, do a pickup on contractor pilot as he took off in a 104. But Titus had had the flu, and he complained to one guy, said, "Man, I still feel like crap." His boss overheard him and said, "Bob, you're not taking that flight." Well, Kinchelow heard it and said, "Hey, Bob, I'll take that. Tell me what you're doing." So he did, and out he went. And Titus said that Kinchelow did not go to burner in that 104. He did a mill power takeoff for whatever reason. Inlet guide vanes closed, the engine shut down. So now this airplane's going down shortly after takeoff. At that time, had a downward ejection seat. Kinch rolled inverted, punched out, but he only got a streamer chute and was killed. Another time, Titus was flying an F-104 Pacer aircraft, and that's a calibrated airplane, and he was flying with a it should have been an XF-8U, and they were calibrating the pedostatic system on the F-8. So as they were going to go for a supersonic test point, Titus moved out a little bit to make sure that the shock waves didn't interfere. And as he did, an F-102 flew right between them, co-altitude. It was so fast, Titus wasn't even sure what it was until he looked back. And the 102 pilot from George shouldn't have been there, but he was. It was such a shock when they hit those shock waves that 102 pilot, when he landed at George, reported that he had a midair when he actually didn't. But as I said, it was a very dangerous time. And in a 10-pilot unit that flight ops that Titus was in, they lost over 15 pilots. And the joke was, you really don't want one of the streets at Edwards named after you because you weren't around anymore. So, one of the most crazy tests that Titus performed is what you saw on the screen when you came in here, is the F-100 zero launch test. This whole thing came about as a result of a concept at the time that said if the U.S. continental, or the continental U.S. were attacked, a lot of our runways would be cratered unusable. So how do you avoid that? Disperse the fighter force. And the way they decided to do that is put these 100s on a truck trailer and disperse them around the country. So they could raise the nose of that thing 20 degrees, had a rocket pod on it, and obviously they had to develop all this stuff. So Titus got the nod to be the project pilot. They set it up so that they strapped this 130,000-pound rocket on the bottom of the airplane there, but it was well aft, and you could not land with that pod on. So it was designed to, as Titus described, you jump in the airplane, strap in, crank it up, go to afterburner, and pull a switch on the front of the throttle. That would ignite the rocket. Boom, 130,000 pounds of thrust for 4 seconds, and you're going 275 miles an hour. And then the rocket pod would fall off. It only gave you about a 4G transverse pressure there. He said it wasn't any big deal. Rocket pod falls off, and away you go do your mission. Everything worked great on the first flight, it was flown by a contractor. The second flight, it didn't. The rocket pod did not come off, and the contractor pilot said, now what do we do? Titus and a flight test engineer jumped in a T-bird, came up, took a look at it, and I think Blackburn was the pilot. He said, well, what do you think we ought to do? Titus says, you ever ejected from fighters? Nope. I said, now you're going to. So they did, lost the airplane as you saw. So Titus did about 10 flights, and one of them that they showed on the film there didn't say where it was, but it was the World Aviation Congress at Indian Springs, Nevada. So Titus was going to do that flight, demo in front of everybody, and the Bob Hoover was there, you know, as Titus was strapping in, and Bob says to Bob Hoover, he says, I think I'll do a roll after this. And Hoover said, no, you don't want to do a roll in front of everybody, you're heavy and everything. Titus blasted off, the rocket came off, he did a roll. So he got tagged for all kinds of things. Titus was sent with another Air Force pilot and Navy pilot over to Europe, and they did some evaluations of the candidate fighters at the time that NATO was looking at. Back at Edwards, he was sent over to North Base and flew what was then extremely secret U-2 program. He said he didn't do much, just put time on the airplane, flew around. But one day his boss said, hey, there's 2 F-100s, 2-seaters sitting out there, nothing to do. Find something to do for those airplanes. Titus came up with the idea of flying over the North Pole and landing at the Paris Air Show. Well, that didn't fly at all. Everybody said, no, you can't do that. One thing led to another, and he had met Charlie Blair. And Charlie had flown a P-51 solo over the North Pole, and he was a real navigation buff. So when he was visiting Edwards, Titus grabbed him, brought him over for dinner at his house, spread the charts on the ground, and said, this is my idea. And Charlie said, that's great. It took some work. They finally got approval. Took 2 F-100s to Europe, and they flew both those airplanes with guys in the back over the North Pole, nonstop, 9-hour flights, 3 refuelings, landed in Alaska, proving under what they called Operation Julius Caesar then, had to put an official name on it, that you could ferry fighters over the North Pole from east side over to Europe and get them there on a one hop. For that, he got another Distinguished Flying Cross, and Charlie Blair got one too. Charlie already had a Harmon Trophy for that other thing. All the time he was at Edwards, though, Titus was very aware that he didn't have a degree. He managed to get through test pilot school based on the engineering training that he did have, but he continually took classes. And somewhere along the line, they selected him to go to the University of Chicago under an Air Force Institute of Technology assignment to get an MBA. Well, the university looked and said, this guy didn't even have a high school degree or a college degree. So they made him take tests, and then they were kind of surprised. They said, we expected you to do well on the technical part based on your test pilot work, but we were really surprised you did so well on the humanities. How did that happen? And he told them about his prodigious reading, as well as going to all those museums, ballets, operas, everything in Europe. So he became a very well-rounded guy. And through his entire life, he read and read and read. I never saw a guy that had as big a library as he did in his basement. So then he was sent over to Bitburg in Germany to fly the F-105D, and they had a nuclear mission, carried 1 Mark 28 nuclear weapon, centerline. And Titus was pretty dismissive of the crazy procedures they had to do at the time under the SIOP, the Strategic Integrated Operational Plan. And one of them, he said, you know, they had to do this specific delivery over the shoulder, kind of did an Immelman, tossed the bomb, and then skedaddle at warp speed. Well, he said they didn't even have time over targets or anything, so there could be nukes going off everywhere. And some bright spark in Washington said, well, that may blind the pilot, so wear one eye patch, and when the other eye is blinded, you can yank that thing off and you can still go land the airplane. That was crazy. So here's a guy that's combat pilot, test pilot, but he still made a gear-up landing in a 105 one day there in Europe. And he said one of his wingmen had had a problem, so he stayed with him a little too longer. He was low on fuel, coming in on a ground control approach. Obviously, they said gear down, he acknowledged gear down and promptly landed and just skidded down the runway. He was so mad that he said if I'd had a pistol, I'd have shot myself right there. Didn't hurt him too much. They made him the flight safety officer for the THUD there in Europe. Then they shipped him back to TAC headquarters, Tactical Air Command headquarters, and put him in Fighter Operations Branch. His main job at the time was to coordinate the big fighter buildup in Vietnam. And his boss was Brigadier General Gordy Graham, who he had met before. Well, he bumped into Graham right after he got there, and Graham said, "What are you flying?" And he said, "Well, not anything really." He said, "Go get your IP rating in the T-33, and you're going to be my pilot." So obviously, all they needed was to have a guy go with the general. So Gordy was already an ace from Europe, so he flew the front seat. Titus rode in the back, and they talked. They flew all over the country. Titus said everywhere they went, Gordy wanted to take his guns and do some hunting, and take his fishing rods and do some fishing along the way. So Titus became the gun and the fishing rod bearer. But he said Gordy told stories all the time, and he learned a lot, Titus learned a lot about leadership from him, to the point where he said, "I took a lot of notes riding in the back there." Well, back at headquarters one time, Gordy hollers out there, "Send earthquake over here." Well, everybody knew it had to be Titus, but that became his call sign. He was never really fond of it, but it was appropriate for a guy who kind of made things shake and rattle. And he was assigned by Gordy to write what was called a General Operational Requirement for the FX. It was a next generation air superiority fighter, and that's what evolved into the F-15. But of course, the fighter pilot doesn't like headquarters work, and he wrangled a job to where he was put in charge of the Scotia Tigers. Now, the group that flew F-5s, Northrop F-5s, in combat. Without all the background, there was this question that came from McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, can we do well with a cheaper fighter? Well, it all evolved to the point where they said, pretty good little fighter. We'll give him to the South Vietnamese Air Force. So while the South Vietnamese pilots are being trained in the US, this unit went over to Vietnam. Titus was in charge of them. They changed the name of the unit, the test unit there, to the 10th Fighter Commando Squadron. Why was it Commando? He said, I don't know. That's the name they put it on it at Benoit. And there, Titus flew over 350 combat missions. Now in the book it says 300. And it was only later, after the book was published, Titus kind of fessed up and said, yeah, it was at least 350, probably more than that. I said, well, why didn't you tell me that? And he said, well, we just didn't log some of them. Why not? We wanted to keep flying. Didn't want to be grounded flying too many. One of those, he saved a Mike Force team. So it was a special ops team out there that had a Green Beret first lieutenant leading it. They had some Nung fighters and others, but boy, they were totally surrounded by the bad guys, and they were screaming for air support. So Titus headed that way, but the whole area was covered in clouds. And he said, but he knew that if he couldn't get through to those guys, they were going to be lost for sure, going to be overrun. So he found a hole, got under it, told the lieutenant, let me know when I fly over, and he did. So he did a 9270 and said, pop smoke. He did, and then he dropped a couple of cans of napalm that discouraged the bad guys, and that Mike Force team got away. Well, that night, while Titus was at the little Scotia Tigers bar, somebody said there was a guy at the door. Well, here was this first lieutenant, face still all covered in camouflage, all sweaty. He had a bottle of champagne and said, if you hadn't done that, we would have been run over. There's no question about it. And then Titus and his guys participated in something called Task Force Dragoon. That was an Army program set up specifically to suck in Viet Cong unit and whack them. And it worked exactly that way, but it was a vicious several-hour battle. Titus and his team, the other pilots, they flew multiple missions, and that got him his third DFC. So I think it was late in '66, they sent Titus over to Da Nang to take over the 389th Tactical Fighter Squadron. And this was a pretty sloppy unit at the time. They weren't making their takeoff times. They weren't making their rendezvous times with the tankers. They weren't hooking up with the 105s on time. So it didn't take him long to slap that unit into shape. And he was criticized by his boss for taking only a few of the pilots on the north missions, escorting 105s. And he said, I don't want all those guys that don't want to go north. I only want hardcore guys who want to go north. And he did. Primary mission was combat air patrol, and they were escorting the 105 fighter bombers. They also did some night attacks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and some radar bombing that wasn't very effective, probably. So one night, his squadron was hit pretty badly with an enemy rocket attack. Things were blowing up all over. 3 o'clock in the morning, Titus jumps in his little Scout, runs down to the flight line, and he said it was a mess. There were dead airmen down there, airplanes blowing up, and he and General Walt, the Marine commander of the time, walked around, and it took a while to get that cleaned up. Just one of many things that happened while he was that commander. But on the 64th mission, 20 May 67, Titus was leading the flight, escorting 105s again, when some MiGs jumped on him. So Titus immediately went after him. He fired 2 Sparrows at one of them. Both of them failed to glide, the AIM-7, radar guided. He fired the 3rd Sparrow, and fortunately it hit the wing root as this MiG was jinking around there. And Titus said, I always wanted to shoot a MiG, and he just yelled out, I got that SOB. So he went after the 2nd MiG, and then his wingman hollered he was bingo. He said, okay, acknowledge, and he was after that MiG, going after him. Pretty soon the wingman says, I am bingo minus. Okay, I got it. And he said, I am no blank bingo minus. All right, so he had to let the MiG go. Called in a tanker. Fortunately, it was a gutsy tanker. It came in from Laos into North Vietnam, and I got that wingman hooked up with what Titus estimated was about a minute of fuel left. He said he had no idea that he was that low. But he didn't get his MiG. 2 days later, though, he went out on another escort flight. 2 MiGs rolled in on him, and they fired missiles, missed, and Titus said, now it's my turn. So he went after him. Fired Sidewinder, just as this MiG went into a little cloud. Missile went right through the same hole and nailed him. So now he's going after the 2nd MiG, who dived to the ground, and they are maneuvering like crazy. Very low altitude, very fast. He couldn't get a lock on with the Sidewinder, the heat seeker, because of clutter and the fact this guy's maneuvering so hard. And they said there was flak everywhere. And the backseater said he saw 2 SAMs coming at him, one of them so close that the backseater literally ducked. He said he thought he was going to just hit the airplane. Titus didn't pay any attention, stayed on the MiG, and he was carrying a gun pod that day on the center line. So when this MiG started to pull up to avoid a hill, Titus just put the pipper ahead of him and, quote, ran a buzzsaw through him. MiG wobbled and went down. So he got his 3rd MiG kill there. He got the Air Force Cross for 2 MiG kills on the same mission. Silver Star for getting that first one. And then he got a 4th Distinguished Flying Cross for some other stuff he did while I was over there. By the end of his tour, he flew his 100 missions. He had logged on the order of 550 air combat missions in Korea and in Vietnam. So he was the ideal guy to head up the Eagle program, the F-15 Eagle development, as a project officer. And he had a pretty heavy-duty team. A lot of you know Rich Riccioni. He was on that, and the famed John Boyd was too. So they put together a pretty good program. Did all the briefings, had to, of Congress and whatever. But Titus really got into a fight, trying to make sure they had a 20 millimeter cannon internal to the Eagle. And a lot of the senior leadership at the time said, we don't need a gun. We're a missile Air Force. And Titus said, we've got to have a gun. Well, he was getting nowhere until the Israeli head of the head of the Israeli Air Force, Major General Mordecai Hod, arrived, and he was campaigning for more F-4s over there. Titus escorted him around, was told he could tell him everything up to confidential. And of course, the conversation, he said, General Hod, in the, I think it was the 6-day war, how many of the enemy were shot down with guns versus missiles? And he said, all guns. Do you want to know why? Well, of course. He said, not PC now. Why waste a missile? So the very next day, there was a briefing for senior officers in this little auditorium. Titus is in the back. General Hod is giving his briefing, and at the end asked for questions. Titus said the same question was asked, same answer was given. One of those 3-star generals turned and kind of mouthed to Titus. As they went out, he slapped Titus and said, I guess you're going to get your gun. And I said, well, did it hurt you? And he said, probably cost me a couple of stars. But he said, every Air Force fighter since then had a gun in it. So he figured that was a big deal. He was obviously on his way up, though, regardless of those little hiccups. So they sent him to Harvard Business School in '68, National War College for almost a year, '69, '70. They sent him down to be the commander of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, pretty storied wing, and it was the first one to get F-15s later, as I recall. But he landed an F-4 at Tyndall one time, and there was a Mustang sitting on the ramp. So he went over, walked around it, had his little nostalgia moment, smelling the coolant, everything. And as he was headed back to his airplane, this old sergeant said, sir, you used to fly that Mustang, didn't you? Yeah, how'd you know? He said, I saw you pat the tail. Titus, when he was asked, what's the best airplane you ever flew? And he said, Mustang. He said it was the best airplane God ever made. So, then he was selected to command the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing over in Okinawa at Kadena. And it was a time of transition. They were changing over to F-4s from 105, so there was a lot of stuff going on. And one night he got a top secret message. It said, I need you to take 2 whole squadrons to Taiwan. Can't tell anybody why. Okay. Well, Taiwan had agreed to give the South Vietnamese their F-5s, but to provide air defense, the Americans said, we'll send 2 squadrons of F-4s up there, but it had to be very much under the radar. And back there at Kadena, they had a formal dining in. All of you veterans know what that is. Put on your mess dress, a lot of toasting and things. Well, to end one of those segments, Titus, being the master of ceremonies, was ready to close them when somebody turned a chicken loose and it ran right down the head table just as Titus was closing, and he just clobbered that chicken right on the head. Said it couldn't have been done better if it had been planned. Well, some people that told the story said they killed the chicken. Others said no, the chicken woke up later and ran off. So the pet people wouldn't be too upset, I guess. He was promoted to brigadier December of '72 and then moved down the street there at Kadena to take over the 313th Air Division. It wasn't there very long, and then they sent him back to Air Force Space Command, or Systems Command headquarters. And when he arrived there, one of the first things he ran into was there was a campaign to take the gun out of the F-4E. And why? They would turn them into wild weasels. They said they needed a place to put the central processor unit for some of the wild weasel gear. And the only place to do that is take the gun out, put it up front there. And I said, well, why? Well, we have to check that thing every 100 hours, okay? And therefore, we have to have access to it. And Titus says, wait a minute, you have to do an engine inspection every 25 hours. Why not put that CPU between the 2 engines? He lost that battle. But he hacked off enough people that he said it pretty much costed him his job, and he was banished over to Belgium to be the Deputy Chief of Staff for Live Oak. Well, at the time, Live Oak was a pretty classified operation, tripartite, so there was a UK, French, and American one-star, and then they had a German colonel there as well. And their job was to do the planning for how we're going to keep the corridor open to get into Berlin if the Russians try to close it again. Well, he didn't have a whole lot to do, so the book talks about things he did, like learning how to speak German and later French, etc. But he had his family with him, and they took a lot of trips around Europe. One of them went into East Berlin, and one of his daughters said she just couldn't believe this happened. The train stopped at the border. Titus opens the train window, and he hollers out to one of the East German guards, say, "Hey, you want a Coke?" And the guy just about died, you know, but he took the bottle of Coca-Cola and hid it inside. And the daughter said, "Dad was always doing this kind of crap." So then he was sent back to Colorado Springs, where I live, and he lived the rest of his life, and made him the Inspector General at NORAD, and at the time was ADCOM, Air Defense Command. So he was working for Chappie James, the first black four-star in the Air Force. Well, he and Chappie went way back as fighter pilots, and that's exactly who Chappie wanted as an IG, because he said, "Bob Titus is the meanest SOB in the Air Force." So his job was to make sure bad things didn't happen in the command. One thing he got involved in was a one-star general was coming into Peterson in a 106 and flamed out, had to punch out, airplane crashed. And they did a quick accident survey, and the finding was pilot error. Well, Chappie didn't buy it, so he sent Titus out to do another evaluation. Titus found that there were 3,000 pounds of fuel trapped in one wing because a transfer pump had failed. So he came back and said, "No, that's not the right answer. It wasn't pilot error." So Chappie notified the chief of staff, "No, we're changing that." Well, the chief said, "If it was a general flying, it is pilot error." No, it wasn't. He said, "Titus will not budge. He will not change his mind." So around that time, Chappie said, "I want to send you to Florida to take over the weapons center down there." And Titus said, "I don't want to go to Florida." "Well, why not?" So "I've been to Florida 3 times, and I just don't want to go again." "Come on, Bob, you got to go. I've got to try to get you promoted. Why don't you want to go to Florida?" He said, "The skiing's terrible, and that elk hunting's even worse." He said, "Well, if you don't go, you're going to have to retire." And he said, "Sign me up." So he retired as a one-star, 1 August 77. But he wasn't ready to just prop his feet up. He got involved in the Air Force Academy football team, got to know Fisher DeBerry pretty well, the coach, as well as a number of the cadets. He sponsored him, had him over to his house, and he basically mentored a lot of them. They learned, I interviewed any number of these guys, and they said, "Man, he taught us a lot about leadership, duty, mission, etc." One time, Gabby Gabreski called him up and said, "Bob, my son Bobby is at the academy and he wants to leave, he wants to quit." He said, "Would you talk to him?" "Yeah, okay." So they made arrangements to where young Bobby would come off and meet with Titus. Well, Gabby said, "I'm flying in too." I said, "Well, how'd you convince him? What kind of argument did you use?" He said, "Well, we just let him stand there, and Gabby and I just worked on a bottle of Johnny Walker Red, and we just talked about losers we had known." And Bobby said, "I'm not leaving." So he graduated, became a C-130, AC-130 gunship pilot. Along the way, Titus did some real estate development. He said, "I became a millionaire, and I lost millions in real estate thanks to the S&L crash." Anyway, he never quit leading. That's the point there. One of the cadets that he inspired to go be a fighter pilot was Chad Hennings. And Chad was an All-American football player there at the academy. And when I interviewed Chad, he said, "I could have just served a few years and gone straight to the NFL. But Titus convinced me I needed to see if I had what it took to be a fighter pilot." So he wound up being an A-10 pilot. And in Chad's words, he said he flew his last mission in the A-10 in Iraq in January, and he came back, took the Air Force uniform off, put on a Dallas Cowboy uniform, played that fall for the Cowboys, and got his first Super Bowl ring the following January. And Chad racked up 2 more Super Bowl rings. I met him last summer. I'll tell you, that's the biggest hand I have ever shaken. So that's pretty much the Bob Titus story. Because he was 96 years old when I was brought in to write his book, we had to get it out in a hurry. So we banged it out in 3 months, and then we had a little bit of hiccup trying to get it published, but we got it published pretty quickly thanks to some gracious donors that stepped up in order to satisfy the publisher's requirements. And one of those donors is here today, Gordon Graham. Where are you, Gordon? Right back there. Gordon wrote a check that primed the pump, and that enabled us to get the book published very quickly. And then in April of last year, the Air Force Academy came through, the Association of Graduates came through with some more money, enabling us to buy 1,025 copies of the Earthquake book. And we gave one to every one of the graduating cadets last year as they came into Arnold Hall Theater for a heritage moment. I was on stage with Earthquake Titus. I introduced him. And then he talked to those cadets about duty, mission, responsibility, and a very rousing speech. Well, at the end, General Jack Catton, who was the moderator, said, well, General, you got to tell them about shooting down that MiG. So he repeated the story, and then he yelled, oh, I got that blankety blank, and the whole place erupted. The cadets loved it. He was one of them. We went around the corner, and we signed over 100 books that day. At the end, Bob said, this was my last mission. And it was. He passed away September 8th last year. But what an honor to know him. So thank you, and I'll take some questions if you have them. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, David? I can't answer that. I don't think Titus could either, but there was a real feeling of the time that guns were passé, and there was even a group that I knew of that said airplanes are passé too. We're going to use all intercontinental ballistic missiles, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a real, a lot of people enamored with missiles at the time. Fortunately, as you guys found out in Vietnam, and other places, we still need the gun. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was curious, the gun pod kill the F-100.
The question was that the only gun pod kill in Vietnam? And I can't answer that for sure, but I know that its primary purpose was air to ground. So how many were taken down, air to air? I can't answer that. Anybody else know by chance? Okay. Guess we'll take one more, if you have it. It's always great to know you covered everything. So, thank you.